Good evening. My name is Drew Caden, and I'm an Associate Vice President for Development at the Rutgers University Foundation. I am honored to welcome you to tonight's program. This event is part of a new series hosted by the Rutgers University Alumni Association, The Way Forward. Alumni and faculty discuss police reform. This series will advance the conversation on policing by featuring Rutgers alumni who have been on the front lines of these issues for years. Tonight, we are joined by Matthew Johnson, a 1990 graduate of Rutgers College. After attending Rutgers, Matt Johnson graduated from New York University School of Law and is currently a partner at Ziffrin Brittingham. In 2008, Matt was the youngest person ever recognized by The Hollywood Reporter as one of the 100 power lawyers in the entertainment industry, and he has remained on that list every year since. He was also named one of the Root 100 most influential African Americans in the United States. In 2015, Matt was appointed to the Los Angeles Police Commission by Mayor Eric Garcetti and immediately elected president of the commission by his fellow police commissioners. As president, Commissioner Johnson oversaw the operations of the 10,000 officer force, set policies, and spearheaded major changes to reduce the use of deadly force by police officers. Most recently, he served as treasurer of the Kamala Harris presidential campaign. It is also my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's discussion, Dr. Nyeema Watson, Associate Chancellor for Civic Engagement at Rutgers University, Camden. Dr. Watson is an experienced leader in civic and community engagement, higher education administration, anchor institution partnerships, policy and program development, and research on issues relating to minority children and youth who live in high poverty areas. Thank you both for being with us this evening. A few housekeeping items before we begin. All attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of the event. If you have questions, please send them via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many questions as possible. It is now my privilege to turn it over to Dr. Nyeema Watson.
Thanks, Drew, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and a special thank you to those of you who are joining us who've been with us for this series we've had thus far this semester. And thank you so much, Matt, for being here this evening and sharing your experience and your time.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get started, this is our third conversation, and the first conversation we had focused on a faculty member who developed a youth-focused initiative on how youth who are attached to the justice system better engage with police officers and how police officers better engage with them. We followed that up with the former chief of the Camden City Police Department talking about his on-the-ground experience in Camden, New Jersey, leading our policing reform effort here. But you come from a different perspective. When I was reading about your work and reading about the commission, at first I thought advisory board, because that's what I think we tend to hear. But this is much deeper than that, the commission and the work that you did. So can you start by just sharing what is the LA Police Commission, what's its role, and what led you to join?
Sure. The Police Commission for the City of Los Angeles is pretty unique. It is definitely the most powerful civilian oversight agency of its kind in the United States, and frankly, it's really born out of the problems and issues that the city of LA has had between the police department and its citizens, going back to the Watts Rebellion, the Rodney King Rebellion in '92. To the first significant civilian consent decree that was issued on the department, given to abuses in their gang units. So we have this very powerful commission that essentially acts as the board of directors for the police department. The chief of police reports to the board. The board is responsible for all policy for the department, and is also responsible for determining whether officers act out of policy when they use serious use of force.
So what led you to join the commission?
Sure. So the mayor is someone I've known for quite a while. We first met when he was elected to city council, and I was president of a Boys and Girls Club in Echo Park, which was an area that had a fair amount of gang violence, and I ran an after school college prep program sort of part-time on the weekends. When he was elected mayor, I served on his 5-person transition team, and one of the roles one of his roles as mayor is he gets to appoint these commissioners. At that time, he asked me to join the police commission. It's a very sort of time-consuming, and I have a day job, and I said thanks, but no thanks. But that was in 2000. That was in 2013. So then the summer 2014, we saw Michael Brown, we saw Eric Garner, and we just saw these issues across the country regarding police use of force. We saw the Black Lives Matter movement take form and really start to draw attention to these issues. And we had some really troubling incidents in the city of Los Angeles. And around that time, the mayor came to me and he said, look, and I had sort of been advising him on the side saying, you should do this, you should do that. And he kept saying, you should join the police commission. And I kept, saying thanks, but no thanks. About the beginning of 2015, he sat me down and we had a real heart-to-heart, and he really asked me to seriously consider it. So I had to answer 2 questions for myself. The first was, are there solutions? Are there reforms that we can institute that will actually make a material difference? The second question was, do we have the political will to actually do it? So the first question was actually fairly easy to answer. President Obama had convened a task force on 21st century policing. He gathered experts from across the country, both community activists and police experts, and they issued a very extensive report. And when I looked at that report and compared it to the policies of the LAPD, there were a number of things that jumped out that I was like, okay, if we do these things, this should make a difference. The second question was a little bit harder to answer. And I sat down with the mayor and I said, look, these are the things that I would pursue. You and I both know it is going to be really difficult. The police departments are very powerful. Police unions are particularly powerful. There's this false narrative out there that police reform is at odds with public safety. Politicians are very much driven by crime rates. And anytime you try to push a police reform agenda, the first thing you're going to hear is that it's going to have a negative impact on crime rates. And I said, so are you on board with this? Are you going to stand behind this all the way? Because if you're not, I really don't want to spend the time. And I don't want to do half measures. We're either going to do this and do it right, or there's other people that I can help you find to put on the commission. And he said, look, we have a moment of time where people are really paying attention to this issue. And we have the political capital to go out and get some of these things done. He's like, I'm not naive. I didn't get elected mayor because I don't understand the politics. It's going to be hard, but I promise you I'm going to have your back and we will do it. And to his credit, he had my back the entire way. And it was really hard, and the politics were real, and the police union fought a lot of the stuff tooth and nail, and command staff fought it, and other politicians fought it. But we were able to make some significant changes.
So talk about some of those changes. In the conversation we had with Chief Thompson, I tried to just make people aware of the backstory. In Camden City, the drive for policing change and reform came from the top. It came from the elected officials. It wasn't this groundswell that we're seeing right now across the country where residents, community activists are driving it. So it was slightly different. So tell me about your situation in terms of, okay, you take this position. What were some of the challenging policies that you had to go up against? What were some of the reforms that you put in place?
Sure. So I knew it wasn't as simple as just coming in and just saying we're going to do X, Y, and Z. You have to do that. You have to lay the groundwork to justify making these changes. And one of the distinguishing factors of the police commission in LA is we have 80 full-time employees. So wow. I was very well resourced. We had an inspector general who had full access to everything in the department. He had his staff of investigators and researchers who could write policy papers for me and do research, and we sent them out to look at different departments around the country and look at things that they were doing. So I really wanted to have a strong foundation to justify what we were looking to do. And so it took time, but so one of the first things we did was we changed the use of force policy. What had happened was most police departments across the country really defaulted to a constitutional case that really was a bare minimum standard. And that then became the standard, like the bare minimum constitutional standard became the use of force standard for all of these police departments. So we changed the use of force policy to essentially make it more restrictive, to require officers to de-escalate situations if it was safe to do so, to only use deadly force as a matter of last resort. There were a number of things, along those lines, a duty to intervene, et cetera. And that was hugely controversial at the time. What was interesting, it was hugely controversial to the extent that one of the heads of the police union at our public meeting when we were voting on it, and this was, he said it publicly, it was widely reported, said, Commissioner Johnson, you are going to have police officer blood on your hands for passing this policy. And it is in my fault you're not attend my funeral should I die in the line of duty. It was very inflammatory language. What's interesting is post George Floyd, the police union actually, when they were being attacked from all angles, all of these police unions, and LA is the third largest in the country, actually advocated the state of California adopting our policy as the policy for the state. It was an interesting lesson. Other things we did was, we did a deep dive. I'm a huge believer in data and transparency. So we wanted to, there's 18,000 police departments across the country. So there's a real lack of data about what is happening in these departments. We don't even really know how often police officers are using deadly force, how many times people are getting killed, because there isn't an obligation to report. The FBI has tried to create a national database, but it's voluntary whether to report to it. So we decided to create a report, a use of force report. It's an annual report done. 2015 was the first year, and it's been done every year since. If anybody's interested, LAPD use of force report, Google it. It's about a 300-page document. It gets very in depth around every incident where an officer had to use deadly force. That document turned out to be very useful. One of the things that jumped out very quickly was the number of times officers were using deadly force when the person they were using deadly force on did not have a firearm. They may have had a knife, they may have had a board, it may have just been a physical contact. And the other thing I realized is that while every police officer obviously had their pistol, every police car was equipped with an assault rifle. And most police officers also had a shotgun. There was no requirement that they have any less lethal equipment in the car. They did not have to carry tasers. They did not have to carry beanbag shotguns. So that was one of the policy changes, is that every officer was required to also carry a taser, and every police car we equipped with either a beanbag shotgun or these other less lethal shotguns, and those were very effective when officers were encountering someone that did not have a firearm. So they did not have to resort to deadly force. We also looked at the training officers were receiving. We instituted significant de-escalation training, both in the training academy and then for every officer that was already on the job. Extensive anti-bias training, extensive training on dealing with people with mental illness. That report that I mentioned, also one of the things that became apparent was that many people that were involved in these instances were suffering from mental illness. And you cannot deal with someone who's suffering from mental illness the same way you deal with someone who's not suffering from mental illness. but police officers are not trained on dealing with, they're not mental health specialists. So trying to give them some tools on how to handle those situations. So all of those things, and you know, we looked at who we're hiring, what are our hiring criteria, and reevaluated that. What behaviors are we rewarding? Who's getting promoted? Who's retaining? Who are we keeping around? So you know, there's no silver bullet, as it were, to solve these issues. And frankly, there's still a lot of work to be done. But over a 3-year period, we were able to reduce the number of officer-involved shootings by 50%. So we were able to have a very significant impact in the number of officer-involved shootings in a relatively short period of time.
So how were these reforms taken by the general public? You know, we're in the space right now where we have activists calling for defunding the police. That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. If you want to comment on President Obama's kind of thoughts about that, you can. But were activists, Black Lives Matter activists specifically, supportive of your work on the commission and supportive of the reforms, or did they have additional concerns and feedback?
So, you know, language really matters, and you have to win. You have to win hearts and minds to get policy through. So I agree with President Obama when he says, you know, when you use the phrase defund the police, you lose a large part of the population immediately, because a huge concern that people have is safety. They want to know when they call 911 that their call is going to be answered and someone is going to show up when they're having some sort of emergency very quickly. And that isn't just in wealthy and middle-class communities, that's in poor communities as well. And I spent a lot of time in every community in the city. It's why the mayor put me on the board. I spent years on the board of the Urban League. I was president of the board of the largest Boys and Girls Club in Los Angeles, which was in the 77th division, which was, you know, historically has always been our most violent and gang-ridden division in the city. You know, people want fair and just policing. They don't want to get rid of policing. And when you talk about defunding the police, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So, I mean, I prefer to talk about reforming policing. There's definitely a reallocation of assets. Like when you think about dealing with people with mental illness, I mean, when Reagan was president, the mental health was gutted throughout our country. So it went from being a medical issue to being a criminal issue. And we need to start getting it back to being a medical issue. So if you talk about reallocating funds, let me tell you, police officers, it's their least desirable call to respond to. There's no joy that they're getting responding to a call when someone's dealing with mental illness. They're very tricky and complicated. And I've been on many of those. I've done literally hundreds of ride-along in over the years, and I've been on those calls, and I see how difficult they are. And to the extent that we can have mental health specialists responding to those calls when someone's not, you know, in a violent state, that's a much better situation. Same thing, a huge number of calls arise out of dealing in LA. Homelessness is a huge problem, and it's not, being homeless is not a crime, but a lot of the issues that come out of homelessness end up going to 911. So police officers have to respond. When there probably are caseworkers that we could be reallocating money to that could be responding, that could actually respond much more effectively. So there's definitely an opportunity to reallocate some resources. There's plenty of opportunity to reform police departments across our country. But I do think we need to not use language that's going to immediately alienate a huge part of the population and make it virtually impossible to get these things accomplished.
So what advice or suggestions would you give individuals who, again, community members who are looking to do this work, who are looking to really encourage their police departments to change? How should they go about it? You talk about certainly reallocation for mental health services, but what other things should they consider, or how should they approach it?
So I think the way to be most effective is really, start by being specific about what it is you're looking for. You mentioned Black Lives Matter activists in Los Angeles. They were not particularly specific about what they were looking for. They really had two demands: fire the chief and defund the police department. But to them, defund the police department meant literally getting rid of the police department and replacing them with I don't know what. Now, there were plenty of other activists, whether it was the National Action Network, which was Al Sharpton's organization, or the Urban League, or the NAACP, or Operation Ceasefire, or the Watts Gang Task Force, local organization in communities that were engaged differently and were effective. So, for example, Watts Gang Task Force, that was a local community organization in the Nickerson Gardens and Jordan Downs housing developments in Watts, Los Angeles. If you know anything about sort of the history of Los Angeles and the housing development, historically, these had been literally the most dangerous places in the city. We had instituted this program called the Community Safety Partnership in those communities, where we embedded police officers that were more like what policing used to be, where you had community police officers that walked the beat, that knew the people that lived there. And we required these officers to make a commitment, multi-year commitment, that they were going to stick in this division. They were embedded in the community. They didn't really do kind of the nicky-knack enforcement, and their charge was to become a part of the community. And this program has been hugely successful. The problem is it's expensive. And we've had donors like Steve Ballmer, who owns the Clippers, formerly of Microsoft, who's been a major donor to, and we've been able to spread it throughout the city. But we've seen is that the crime rate in those housing developments dropped to some of the lowest actually in the city. And more interesting, the solve rate of crimes went through the roof because there's a trusting relationship between the police officers and the community. Community knows who's committing these crimes. They know what's going on. They just didn't trust the police officers to give them that information. So now that relationship is much different, and they have weekly meetings, that's something to look at. There's lots of resources out there. I mentioned the President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which has some real, concrete reform initiatives that they suggest. There's Campaign Zero, which has the 8 Can't Wait, which has been very effective. Certainly post George Floyd, and getting cities on board with, and frankly, every city should adopt their 8 Can't Wait. Like, there's not one thing that they're promoting that's controversial. To me, that's like the bare minimum. But most cities don't. Most cities aren't even at that bare minimum.
So why is there that tension? Is it not having progressive leadership by the chief or city council? Is it the police unions? Like, what is stopping some of these things from happening that I think, yes, from the general population do seem very basic?
I think it's all of the above. Police unions are incredibly powerful in the state. So if you took a poll in California before the last election cycle about who was in favor of police reform, it was polling in the low 70%. Like, that's insane, an insanely high number. The California legislature, both the Assembly and the State Senate, are hugely Democratic. It's not even a close. They have huge Democratic majorities. The governor is a Democrat. There were a number of police reform bills that were being debated. Not one of them could even get to the floor for a vote.
Wow.
And that is solely because of the power of the police unions that prevented it from getting to the floor for a vote. They have a lot of money. They raise a lot of money. And these local elections, there's not a lot of money that's spent. So even in a city like Los Angeles, right, if you're running for president, you can literally donate hundreds of thousands of dollars to your preferred candidate. If you're running for mayor in the city of Los Angeles, the most you can donate is $800 in the primary and $800 in the general. So what that means is, like, I think it would be a good thing if PACs couldn't spend unlimited amounts of money.
Yes.
So you have the police union that will come in and they will spend a few $1 million on a race. And think about how many donors you have to get to write $1,600 check to get to $2 million. It's a lot of donors. It's very difficult to do. So they're very powerful. They're not all powerful though. And we just saw in LA, there was a very important race for district attorney between a very progressive DA who came out of San Francisco, George Gascon, who I did a lot of work supporting, against an incumbent, Jackie Lacey, who had the support of the LAPD's police union, the sheriff's police union, because she had been very strongly pro-police throughout her career, but she ended up losing the election. Where in the past, having the endorsement of the police union pretty much guaranteed you were going to win the DA's race. Again, because people want safe communities first and foremost.
So you had mentioned earlier that I think you said the head of the union subsequently, wanted to go on record endorsing some of the reforms that happened under your tenure. How did the police officers themselves feel? What were you hearing from them about their work kind of prior to the reforms and their work afterwards, or even like what they're thinking now with the state of the country?
So I spent a lot of time talking to police officers. I felt like I needed to take my case directly to them, rather than them reading about it in the LA Times, or how it was translated to them through the police union and their periodicals, who would routinely obviously slam me. I spoke at every graduation, and I would have one-on-one conversations with every graduate, which were every month. We graduate about 40 new officers every month. And the one thing I found is that the vast majority of police officers go into it with the right intentions, but there is definitely a culture in police departments that can change even those with the best of intentions. So I spent a lot of time talking to police officers, going to roll calls, explaining why I was pushing what I was pushing, what I thought it meant for public safety, what I thought it meant for officer safety, what I thought it meant for just fairness and racial equity. There were things that we did, like I didn't even mention this, but LA is the only large police department in the country that has body cameras on all its officers. That in and of itself was hugely controversial. What was more controversial was when I pushed through a video release policy so that every officer involved shooting and use of force, the footage of that would become public within 30 days.
Wow. And
there was a huge outcry amongst the officers about that. They thought it was going to lead to riots, and it was going to be pandemonium. And the truth of the matter is that actually, and I said this, I knew it was going to be the case, if the public doesn't expect officers to be perfect, they also understand that there are going to be officers that are going to do bad things. What the public is not okay with is people not being held accountable for their actions when they do that. So as long as we are honest and we are transparent and we hold people accountable, then we really shouldn't have anything to worry about. When people think that we're being dishonest, that we're hiding stuff and we're not holding people accountable, that's when you have issues. And I would remind the officers that the rebellion that happened in Rodney King did not happen after the video of him getting beaten by the police officers was released. It happened after the police officers were acquitted, because people were upset that no one was being held accountable when the evidence couldn't have been more clear.
Right.
And what we have seen time and again is, we release, now that I don't even know how many of these incidents there have been, but every single one. And there's been some, there's just been some really tragic ones, including one where a guy who was high on meth had a knife across a homeless woman's throat, and tragically 2 officers, ultimately he was starting to cut her, fired on him, and ended up shooting and killing the woman he had the knife, an innocent victim. It was tragic, but there was no cover up. It was released. Where the officers went wrong was discussed, and I think the public accept that. I think they would not have accepted those things had all of a sudden the video not been released and explanations been given, etc. That's where the problems come into play.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind everybody, we're about to start transitioning to questions, and we have one here from Steve. Thank you, Steve. I'll get to it in a moment. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. So one last question I'll ask before we go to the community questions. How should communities be pushing for the type of commission that LA has? How do we move from these kind of broad advisories where they just seem to be kind of check-ins and there's a lot of platitudes, but no force and no teeth?
Right.
How do we get to where LA is at?
Most what you have is civilian complaint review boards. Most of them are they're not, they're advisory. And the problem with that is you're dealing with a problem after it happens. And you're at best, all you're doing is holding that one officer accountable for that one act. And really what you want to get to is changing the systems, reforming the actual department, having a say in how the police are actually going about their jobs. So in LA, that was actually done through a charter amendment. So it's in the city's constitution. And that's one of the problems with policing, is that you literally have 18,000 different departments across the country. So and then each state has its own laws about how they regulate police officers and the standards that they apply. So I think what we really have to do, we have to see leadership at the national level to put some national standards in place. You need to see leadership at the state level, and you have to see legislation passed that requires certain policies to be in place. And then at the local level, individuals need to rally their communities to push for these reforms with their individual police departments. And there's other resources out there. There's an organization that is specific to police oversight. I'm blanking on the name. It'll come to me in a second. But it actually, one of the resources that they provide to communities is like, look, here are different models that you can have. And there isn't one size that fits all for every community. Mm-hmm. So I think every community has to look at and think about what works in their community. But at a minimum, you can push your elected officials, your police chiefs, to be more transparent, to have public meetings. We had our formal meetings, but at least every other week I was meeting with one group or another group, or I was at one church or another church and meeting with people formally and informally to hear them out. And you need to have your representatives be held accountable to understanding what the needs and wants and concerns of their communities are.
Okay. I lied. I do have one more question. It was, when are you going to run, and what are you going to run for? Because you seem to be a really forceful leader who can bring about change, and that's wonderful. But with the work you did with the Biden-Harris campaign, understanding their policies and their approaches, what do you think is on the horizon in this space of police reform, either from the background of Vice President Harris or the work that was done under the Obama administration? Do you think you're going to see some of that as a part of the Biden administration?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic for what's in store. I've been close to Kamala since she was the DA of San Francisco, and so I've known her really well. When I was contemplating going on the police commission, she was one of the people I talked at length to. I got her thoughts and opinions about what areas I should pursue, what would have the greatest impact, and also just the politics of it. She was very savvy to the politics of it. So she's very sort of knowledgeable about these issues. And when she was elected state attorney general in California, she pursued a lot of these things, and data was a big thing that she created this great open database. I think that they will pick up, really it was a shame because there was a lot of positive momentum that was generated by the Obama administration and that Justice Department. And they were pursuing a number of consent decrees across the country, really reforming a bunch of troubled police departments. And when Trump was elected, that they literally shut it all down. As a matter of fact, they tried to undo, like Baltimore's, which was already in progress. They tried to roll it back. And fortunately, the judge was like, no way, we're not allowing you to do that. But they totally went in the opposite direction. I expect that the Biden administration is going to pick up exactly where the Obama administration left off, and they're going to be quite aggressive about. And I know not just Vice President Harris, but President Biden cares deeply about these issues and is very thoughtful about them. And I expect that we're going to see some real progress on a national leadership level.
Great. So I'm just looking at some of the questions that have been submitted. Okay. Oh, we answered a lot of them. So I'll go to the first question that we had submitted tonight by Steve. He says, people call 911 where their family members are in crisis. Most start out nonviolent, then turn violent. I agree, maybe social workers could be a better resource. How would you effectively have social workers available 24 hours a day to respond when a crisis occur and also protect the social workers? I know that's something they're attempting to do in Philadelphia, and sadly they say the social workers, they don't have the funding to have the social workers there 24 hours a day on the calls. So how would you respond to that?
So that is a very fair and legitimate question. In LA, we actually have we have social workers, trained mental health specialists embedded with police officers. And as often as possible, we have them, geographically, LA is as large as New York City, which has 4 times as many police officers. So we already spread pretty thin. But in the 4 geographic boroughs, we have 24 hours a day. There are a number of units that are embedded with police, with mental health specialists. And we have said, so part of the problem is, and this is not unique to LA, it's around the country, is not every jurisdiction has mental health specialists. So LA, actually, we don't have any. That's a county function, not a city function. But we have said to the city, it's 2 police officers for every mental health specialist. We've said, look, as many mental health specialists as you can give us, because this is a massive problem for us. We will create, we will staff it with police officers. Now, our 911 operators are very well trained. There are those instances that where they have more of a potential to lead to violence than others. And so there are plenty of instances where it is safe for mental health specialists to respond without police officers. And, they can respond. And if they are, if it becomes a dangerous situation, they become at risk, they can immediately call 911, they can remove themselves from the situation. The reality is we have caseworkers dealing with our homeless population that are in potentially dangerous situations all the time. We have people giving parking tickets that are in potentially dangerous situations all the time. So yes, there is that potential, but just because there is that potential sometimes doesn't mean you have to not have that capability in the 99% of the time where it's not going to become that situation.
Thank you. This was a question submitted with the registration. What is being done or will be done to get to the root of, identify, and address the racism and contempt in police departments? I know you talked about some of the reform efforts, I think body cameras, accountability, knowing when there's a deadly shooting that those things are going to be addressed. And I think that will get at some of this. But what are some other things that you think should happen or
I'll tell you, so there's and this is a nationwide issue with bias policing complaints, right? And it's very hard to prove bias because you're trying to look into someone's brain. But what we have found is that the fact that our officers have body cameras and they are required to, in every interaction, no matter what, it's not just when they think they're going to be using deadly force, every interaction with a civilian, their body camera has to be activated. And one thing we have found is just, going back and looking at that footage is very helpful to see what actually happened. But we do mediations where we bring in the complainant and we bring in the police officer and we have them watch it and we have them with a trained professional and kind of talk through what were you thinking? What was going on? And that has actually been really helpful, both for officers to kind of reevaluate how they deal with people and for civilians also to kind of have a better understanding of from the officer's perspective. The other thing that we did, as I mentioned, is we did extensive anti-bias training through the department. And we did a lot of research around the country about the program that we thought would be best suited. Interestingly, of everything I did, it was probably the most controversial. And it was controversial. People hear anti-bias training and they immediately think that you're calling them a racist. And that by having to have anti-bias training, it's because they're racist and now you have to make them not racist. So it kind of creates a very visceral reaction and it's hard to overcome that going in. And we found this great professor out of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Professor Marks, and we did a test run with him. And it went so well, we ended up doing it with the whole department. And of course, after any of these trainings we do, there's always the post-training surveys that we do. And when I say it was the least popular thing going in, I mean, that is a huge understatement. The anger that people had about having to do this was unmatched. It ended up being the most popular training that we did in 2 years. It was off and by a long shot. People really started to get it. And it's not as if going through, 1 4-hour training is going to, change hearts and minds and totally fix a problem, but it is definitely a start. And it is a training that look, we have officers do literally hundreds of hours of firearms training in the academy, right? And most officers never draw a gun. Right. So having things having 4 hours of anti-bias training is a drop in the bucket. We actually need to do these other trainings at the level that we do all of the force trainings that we do, teaching people how to do takedowns and put handcuffs on and shoot their firearms. Well, de-escalation training and anti-bias training and dealing with the mentally ill needs to be on par with that training as well.
Fantastic. Another question here this evening from Andrew Stein. A common narrative is that wealthy communities spend less on police than other communities. However, some of the wealthiest communities in the US, including Beverly Hills, spend most of their budgets on police. Do you think communities spend too much on police, or is it that just an equitable policing is expensive, meaning that social justice reforms would need to be funded not by cutting police budgets, but from other sources? There's a lot there.
I think, there's a lot there. I think a lot of money is spent on policing. policing is expensive. The equipment is expensive. Police officers are well paid, and they should be well paid. We have seen the problems in cities like New Orleans when police officers are not well paid, the problems that can lead to. I think there really needs to be a hard look at how we're spending money. When there's talk of cutting police budgets, which is definitely happening in LA right now, the COVID crisis has caused a huge budget shortfall, and there's major conversations going on regarding cutting budgets across the board, and the police department won't be immune to that. And I imagine that's happening in cities across the country. The first thing to go will be the soft program, the community policing programs. The training will go very quickly, because they'll be like, well, we can't take officers out of the field for training because we had to cut the number of officers. So you really have to be careful about, when you're cutting budgets, like what that's actually going to mean. So it needs to be very, very thoughtful about what a budget is and how it's being spent. Another thing that is a problem, and again, this is largely, police unions have had a huge amount of influence on this. In the large department, a lot of work that is done by police officers should be done by civilians. And civilians are a lot less expensive to keep on your payroll than police officers. And there are just so many tasks that you do not need someone that has trained with a gun and a badge to do. And I just think that there really needs to be a rebalancing in these police departments about what are the jobs that civilians should be doing as opposed to peace officers. And that is actually a way that you could save a significant amount of money.
Thank you. Another question that was submitted with the registration, Rob Galo, to the extent that police union contracts prevent and hinder necessary reform measures, what can local jurisdictions do within the current confines of agreements that protect bad actors?
Yeah, I think there really has to be negotiation. I had a lot of negotiations with the police union over different policies that we were putting through that were arguably at odds with their contracts, and there also just needs to be legislations. I think you touched on a point there that right now there really isn't any sort of database of police officers that have been fired or that have resigned while being under serious investigation. And what we have is that you have officers that have been terminated for a bad act in one department that then get a job in another department. And you have some officers that have been fired 2 or 3 times and they're still able to bounce around from one department or another department. So we really need to start looking at state and federal databases of these officers so that there is an ability for them to do something that would get them fired in one jurisdiction but still be able to get a job in another jurisdiction.
So what's the challenge to this reform? Is it because of the power of the police unions? These seem like common sense approaches, and Joseph wrote that here tonight. Why do you think police unions are opposed to some of these common sense reform efforts? Is it political will? What stops some of these things from happening?
I think, look, their charge is to protect their members, right? And there's always like this parade of horribles in their mind of if the slippery slope, if we agree to this and it's going to mean that, all of the things that came to, that they claimed would come to pass when we changed the use of force policy of, officers being injured on the job. That did not happen at all. We obviously tracked very closely officer safety and whether, what situations where they've been injured. There was no increase to officer injuries on the job when we changed the use of force policy. Changing the video release policy there was I think a bona fide, I don't think they were making it up, like they really believed that it was going to lead to riots and put their make their jobs more dangerous and put the city in peril. And that obviously did not come to pass. If anything, the number of times, there was one case that we had a blanket policy of not releasing video. And there was a shooting in the city where the police officer said that the suspect had a gun, pointed the gun at the police officers when he was shot. Well, there was a strong belief in the community that he did not have a gun. And there was a big protest, and I went out to the protest, and I just was, just wearing jeans and t-shirt and just kind of walking around and talking to people. And without a question, the strong belief was that the police officers, that they planted a gun, that he did not have a gun, that people knew him and he never carried a gun. Well, we knew he had a gun because in the chase, there were two different places where there were security cameras. The officers didn't have body cameras before the body cameras, but there were two different times in the chase where security cameras from buildings showed him with a gun in his hand. And there was one point right before the shooting took place where he was behind the car and he had the gun like this. And I was like, I reached out to the mayor and I reached out to the chief of police. I'm like, we need to release this footage. Like, this is getting very volatile. Mm-hmm. And people just don't believe that he had a gun. This is going to put an end to it. Like, let's just release it. And it was controversial because, we didn't want to be accused of, okay, you're only releasing the footage when it helps you, not when it hurts you. But I did feel it was extraordinary because, part of my job was feeling like I need to prevent a riot in our city from happening. So we released the footage and it totally calmed things out. I happened to be scheduled for a meeting with the National Action Network just like 2 or 3 days later. And their headquarters were right in the community where this shooting had taken place. And it was a full house, and it was a really sort of great conversation. But sadly, like 3 family members from the young man who was shot and killed were there, and his cousin, the young woman, asked me. She said, when you released that footage, the community was with us. Mm-hmm. But when you released that footage, the community turned against us, and no one even wants to show up to his funeral now. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, yeah. Like, we released the footage because it was factual and accurate, and people should be making their decisions based on the truth. And if a gun had been planted, or if he didn't have a gun, there should be consequences to that, to the officers mm-hmm. involved under this situation. But likewise, when these tragic situations happen, it's important for people to know the truth of why something happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for a last question, what work under your tenure do you feel was left unfinished that you wish the commission would take on, or other ideas and suggestions? You're not that far removed from this racial rights. What other things should they be focusing on right now?
That's a good question. I mean, there's still a lot to do. Really, what I would be focused on right now is the use of resources. Really reallocating resources to towards community policing, finding ways to have what are currently police responses to issues dealing with homelessness or mental illness be offloaded to other divisions of the other organizations within the city family, and really have police officers focus on what they're meant to focus on, which is keeping communities safe and solving crime, and having other resources within the city that can do things more safely, more efficiently, and more cost effectively focus on those areas.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. I could have talked to you all night long, so I really appreciate your thoughts.
It was a pleasure
joining us this evening. Drew?
So on behalf of the Rutgers University Alumni Association, Nyeema and Matt, I want to thank you. This has been such a wonderful discussion on a really important and timely topic. I also want to thank all of our attendees for joining us this evening. If you were unable to join us for the previous 2 installments of the series, you can view the full recordings on the Rutgers Alumni YouTube channel. Thank you again, and we hope you will join us at a future alumni event very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.